At 9:47 on the morning of June 6, 1944, the sky over southern England was already crowded with aircraft. Engines roared, propellers blurred, and history moved forward on a timetable measured in minutes. Far below, men were fighting and dying on the beaches of Normandy. Above them, the fate of the invasion depended on air superiority. Lieutenant Thomas Fraser eased the throttle forward and lifted his P-51B Mustang into the air. The aircraft beneath him, sleek olive drab, powered by a Packard-built Merlin engine, was built for one purpose: to keep German fighters away from Allied troops. Fraser knew the mission. He trusted the machine. What he could not know was that within hours, this very aircraft would be sitting intact in a French field deep inside enemy territory. And what followed would be even more extraordinary. Within days, one of Germany's most skilled test pilots would be flying Fraser's Mustang over the heart of the Reich. Not in combat but in careful evaluation. That single test flight would confirm a truth the Luftwaffe feared, but had not yet fully accepted. The balance of power in the air had shifted. This is not just the story of a forced landing on D-Day. It is the story of how the enemy learned firsthand why the P-51 Mustang was winning the war in the skies. The problem began quietly. At 12,000 feet over northern France, Lieutenant Thomas Fraser was doing exactly what Allied doctrine demanded on D-Day, holding position above the bomber stream, watching the sky for German interceptors. There was no dramatic explosion, no enemy fighter in his gun sight. Instead, the danger came from inside the aircraft itself. The engine began to run rough. Oil pressure dropped. Coolant temperature climbed. Fraser's eyes moved instinctively to the gauges, and what he saw left no room for optimism. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin that gave the P-51 Mustang its legendary performance was also its greatest vulnerability. Unlike most German engines, it was liquid-cooled. Radiators sat beneath the fuselage, with coolant lines running through the airframe. One small leak caused by flak, a stray bullet, or metal fatigue was enough to doom the engine within minutes. Fraser had no choice. He radioed his flight leader, broke formation, and began descending. Ahead of him lay enemy territory. Below him, a patchwork of fields and hedgerows stretched across occupied France. German troops were everywhere, but staying airborne was no longer an option. If the Merlin seized at altitude, there would be no landing at all. Fraser selected a field that looked just barely long and flat enough. Landing gear down, flaps extended. He brought the Mustang in as gently as circumstances allowed, touching down on rough grass and rolling to a stop. When the aircraft finally stood still, it was almost intact. No bent propeller, no collapsed landing gear, no visible airframe damage. Only an engine that would never restart. Fraser climbed out of the cockpit and took one last look at his aircraft. Then he turned and walked away, hoping to disappear into the countryside before German patrols arrived. He did not get far. Within hours, German troops captured him, and while Fraser's war would continue behind barbed wire, the story of his Mustang was only just beginning. The aircraft remained in the field for less than 6 hours. A specialized German recovery unit arrived before Allied fighters could return to strafe it. These units, trained specifically to salvage downed enemy aircraft, worked with speed and precision. Fuel was drained, the battery disconnected, the cockpit sealed, guards posted. By nightfall, a heavy flatbed truck was backing up to the Mustang. By dawn, the next morning, it was loaded onto a train heading east. Its destination was Rechlin. Located roughly 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin, Rechlin was the Luftwaffe's primary aircraft testing center. Since 1936, every new German design and every flyable captured enemy aircraft had passed through its runways and hangars. If Fraser's Mustang could be made airworthy, this was where Germany would uncover its secrets. And uncover them, they intended to do urgently. Rechlin was not a combat base. It was a place where illusions went to die. For the Luftwaffe, the arrival of Fraser's P-51B Mustang, on June 8, 1944, came at a moment of quiet desperation. Only 6 months earlier, American bombers had been vulnerable deep inside Germany. Their escorts P-38 seconds and P-47 seconds were capable aircraft, but they lacked the range to stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German fighters had exploited that weakness mercilessly. Then the Mustang appeared. By December of 1943, P-51 seconds were escorting bombers over targets once considered unreachable. Berlin, Munich, industrial centers in central Germany. Kill ratios that had long favored the Luftwaffe began to reverse. Yet German command still lacked one thing's certainty. They needed first-hand knowledge, not combat rumors or pilot anecdotes. That responsibility fell to Hans-Werner Lerche. At 30 years old, Lerche was already one of Germany's most experienced test pilots. Trained as an engineer, he had flown more than 120 different aircraft types, German prototypes, Italian fighters, captured Soviet machines, British bombers, and American fighters. He had test-flown Spitfires, Lancasters, P-38 seconds, and P-47 seconds. He could take an unfamiliar aircraft into the air without a manual, relying only on engineering logic and instinct. Remarkably, he had never crashed a single airplane. When Fraser's Mustang arrived at Rechlin, Lerche was given just 2 days to prepare it for flight. That urgency spoke volumes. Mechanics worked around the clock. They removed the Merlin engine, found the coolant leak that had forced Fraser down, and repaired it. Every control surface, fuel line, and hydraulic system was inspected for sabotage or hidden damage. To prevent German anti-aircraft fire, the aircraft's underside and tail were painted bright yellow. Large black crosses were added to the wings and fuselage. A German designation T9 plus HK was applied. The fuel tanks were filled with captured high-octane American gasoline. By the morning of June 10, the Mustang was ready. Lerche approached the aircraft with professional detachment. The walk-around inspection took 20 minutes. He noted the smooth skin, flush rivets, and thin wings far thinner than those of the Bf-109 or 4-190. The Laminar Flow Wing was immediately recognizable, a design optimized to reduce drag at high speed. The cockpit was spacious by German standards, the layout logical, though every gauge was marked in English and American units. At 8:42, Lerche signaled the ground crew. The Merlin engine turned over, caught, and settled into a rough idle. As oil temperature climbed, the sound struck him as different, higher-pitched, smoother than German engines. When the gauges stabilized, he released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. The takeoff was a revelation. The Mustang accelerated faster than any German fighter he had flown. The tail came up smoothly. At 90 miles per hour, the aircraft lifted off and climbed steeply away from Rechlin. Within minutes, Lerche understood that this was not an overrated enemy machine. This was something else entirely. Hans-Werner Lerche did not draw conclusions from a single flight. Over the next 2 days, he flew Fraser's Mustang 4 more times, each mission designed to answer a specific question the Luftwaffe desperately needed resolved. High-altitude performance, dive behavior, fuel consumption, engine sensitivity, control response at the edge of the envelope. These were not demonstration flights. They were methodical examinations. The results were unsettling. At altitude, the Mustang remained fast and stable. Lerche climbed it beyond 36,000 feet, without difficulty. In a steep dive, he pushed past 450 miles per hour, well beyond what most German fighters could safely manage. Acceleration in level flight was exceptional. Even when throttled back, the aircraft retained energy in a way German pilots would immediately recognize as dangerous in combat. Just as striking was how forgiving the Mustang was near the stall. Lerche deliberately flew it into marginal conditions: power off, power on, clean configuration, landing configuration. Each time, the aircraft gave clear warning. Control forces softened. Buffeting began. And when the stall finally arrived, it was gentle. No violent wing drop. No snap roll. No sudden spin. Compared to the Bf-109, which could punish even a small mistake, or the 4-190, which could drop a wing aggressively, the Mustang allowed a pilot to fly at the limit without courting disaster. That mattered. A fighter that could be flown aggressively without killing its pilot was a weapon in itself. Lerche noted weaknesses. The Merlin engine demanded careful handling. Poor throttle discipline or incorrect mixture settings could cause overheating. The internal fuselage fuel tank affected stability when filled to certain levels, especially in hard maneuvering. But these were manageable issues. They did not outweigh the aircraft's strengths. When Lerche compared the Mustang to Germany's best fighters, the Bf-109G10 and the FW-190D9, his conclusion was blunt. Only those two aircraft could compete with it, and even then neither held a clear advantage. The Mustang matched them in speed, equaled or exceeded them in range, turned more predictably, and retained energy better throughout a fight. Lerche's report was typed, classified, and distributed. Copies went to Luftwaffe High Command. Others went to fighter units defending German airspace. The message was unambiguous. The P-51 Mustang was the most dangerous Allied fighter in the sky. Pilots were warned not to underestimate it, not to assume automatic superiority, and not to expect easy disengagement once contact was made. Soon after, the Mustang designated T9+HK began appearing at Luftwaffe airfields across Germany. This was the work of the unit informally known as the Rosarius Traveling Circus. Commanded by Theodor Rosarius, its purpose was to educate German pilots about Allied aircraft by showing them, not telling them. At briefing rooms, pilots were warned that the Mustang could turn tighter than expected, roll faster than anticipated, and follow them far beyond what earlier escorts could manage. Then came the demonstrations. In mock dogfights, German pilots watched as a Mustang stayed with a Bf 109, through hard turns rolled faster than an FW 190, and simply pulled away in level flight when it chose to disengage. When the aircraft landed, the mood was subdued. The implications were impossible to ignore. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was forced to accept a reality it could no longer deny. The enemy had built a fighter they could not easily counter. To understand why the P-51 Mustang mattered so deeply, it is necessary to step back from Rechlin and look at the wider war. Before the Mustang, the American daylight bombing campaign was in crisis. Heavy bombers could reach only as far as their escorts would allow. P-38 seconds and P-47 seconds performed well near the edges of occupied Europe, but deep inside Germany the bombers were exposed. Loss rates of 8 to 10% per mission were unsustainable. Crews were dying faster than they could be replaced, and senior commanders quietly questioned whether daylight bombing could continue at all. The Mustang changed that calculation. With its long range and high altitude performance, the P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back. It could loiter above formations, engage interceptors, and still have fuel to pursue retreating fighters. For the first time, American bombers were no longer operating on borrowed time once they crossed the German border. In February of 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle altered American fighter doctrine in a way that fully exploited the Mustang's strengths. Fighters were no longer chained to tight defensive escort. Instead, they were ordered to seek out German aircraft, aggressively, to pursue them, and to destroy them wherever they could be found in the air or on the ground. The objective shifted from protecting bombers to eliminating the Luftwaffe itself. This combination of doctrine and technology proved devastating. German fighter units were forced into constant reaction. If they rose to intercept bombers, Mustangs were already waiting above them. If they disengaged, Mustangs followed. If they attempted to land, American fighters often chased them to their airfields. Over time, the Luftwaffe lost what it could least afford to lose: experienced pilots. By contrast, the United States could replace aircraft, fuel, and trained air crews at a pace Germany could not match. This was not simply a contest of aircraft performance. It was a contest of industrial capacity, training systems, and strategic flexibility. After the war, captured German pilots confirmed what Luftwaffe test reports had already admitted. They respected the Mustang. They feared its speed and endurance. Many acknowledged that only the most skilled German pilots dared to engage one in a turning fight. By the spring of 1945, the air war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Mustang did not win the war alone, but it made possible a strategy that Germany could no longer survive. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war. When Germany surrendered in May of 1945, he was captured by American forces who immediately recognized his value. They questioned him extensively, not as an enemy, but as an expert. They wanted to know what he had flown, what he had learned, and what he truly thought of American aircraft. When asked about the P-51 Mustang, Lerche did not hesitate. It was one of the finest fighters he had ever flown. Fast, balanced, well-engineered, and deadly in the hands of a trained pilot. After the war, Lerche returned to civilian life in Germany. He worked as an engineer and occasional test pilot, and in 1980 he published his memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot. The chapter on the Mustang was among the longest. He did not describe it with bitterness. He described it with respect. To Lerche, good engineering transcended national boundaries. Lieutenant Thomas Fraser also survived. Captured on D-Day, he spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner in Germany. He was liberated in May of 1945 and returned home to the United States that summer. For decades, his service record listed only a single line: one aircraft lost to mechanical failure over enemy territory on June 6, 1944. It did not mention that his Mustang, nicknamed Jerry, had become one of the most valuable intelligence assets the Luftwaffe ever possessed. That aircraft, designated T9+HK, was lost in December of 1944, but by then, its impact had already been felt. The P-51 Mustang changed the air war over Europe not through a single innovation, but through a rare combination of qualities: speed, range, maneuverability, reliability, and mass production. More than 15,000 were built. They escorted bombers deep into Germany, hunted enemy fighters, and returned home with fuel to spare. They allowed Allied air power to operate freely, relentlessly, and decisively. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring later admitted that he knew the war was lost when he saw Mustangs over Berlin. It was not the sight of bombers that broke the Luftwaffe. It was the knowledge that German fighters could no longer stop them. The lesson endures. Technological superiority in war is not about perfection. It is about balance, timing, and the ability to sustain advantage. The P-51 Mustang embodied all three. Even its enemies understood that truth. And sometimes, the most powerful confirmation of history comes not from victory parades, but from the respect of those who were defeated.